I met Phil Davis in 1976 in the forum of the law school over there. And I just stopped by there and sat in that same space where I met him just now to warm myself up. Alice Tomlinson Lorenz introduced Phil to me in 1976 in the law school forum. And she's one of my dearest friends. Her husband's one of my dearest friends. And Phil has become one of my dearest friends. And we've been friends for 45 years.
I knew Phil Davis from the time we were in law school. He was a year ahead of me in law school.
I first met Phil Davis when I was a law student. I had drafted a memo for the ACLU about roadblocks and the Fourth Amendment. And I went over to the ACLU to present it to Phil and Maureen Sanders, which was like the Supreme Court of Civil Rights. And then after that, I knew him as a friend. We would have breakfast every couple of months, and a colleague. And then he would teach at the law school during the clinic sessions. He'd come in and lecture on attorney's fees.
Phil and I worked on, I don't know how many, dozens of cases together, including 3 massive class action lawsuits that go over a quarter century. So we've worked together. I've spent more minutes with Phil Davis as a lawyer than any other lawyer. Phil and I also had a friendship, and so I knew his wife, I knew his children, and his daughter Rachel, his firstborn, and my daughter Rachel, my firstborn. His Rachel was my Rachel's babysitter. And so Rachel number 1, the young one, named herself, and Rachel number 2, the babysitter, have been friends for decades too.
I tell people that, when I noticed Phil as a second-year law student when I was first-year law student, after I got my head out of the books for a while, I looked over and I thought, God, he's cocky. I retained that description of Phil over the last 45 years. Although the cockiness I learned was for different reasons. The original cockiness was a young, smart, good-looking guy who was gonna take on the world and knew everything. He later learned he didn't know everything, but he didn't lose his cockiness because he became so proficient and knowledgeable in the area of law that he worked in that it was almost a right to be cocky because he knew what he was doing.
My favorite thing about Phil is he was so human. Leon Howard, the ACLU legal director, described him as the perfect mix of gruffness and sweetness. He had this sort of strong personality and exuded confidence, but we'd have breakfast and I could talk to him about anything, whether it was a case, it was my dog passing away. He was just such a lovely human being. And you saw that in his work, you saw that in his dedication to his clients, but you really saw that as a friend.
Phil's passions were too numerous for this video to capture, but some of the ones we overlapped on were his passion for making sure that no one would be mistreated by the government and get away with it. And it's impossible, of course, for even Phil to have righted every wrong when people would come to him. They came in droves to Phil for help. But Phil bent over backwards, if he couldn't take the project, to try and find someone who could, because Phil wanted everyone to get justice.
After I had done some practice, private practice, I went to the law school to teach full-time for 10 years. And when I left there, I set up a practice with Duff Westbrook, and we were right next door to Phil. And so the 3 of us were doing civil rights cases, and we had a blast. We were serious, but we had a blast because we had a cadre of people who thought about things. It was a great brain trust.
Just a brilliant writer, just able to get right to the heart of a matter. And you could see that in the way that he worked his cases, in the way that he handled mediations. Al Bronstein was an old-time prison litigator from the ACLU. Was out here, and we went to see some prison clients together, and he once told the prison client that I had, Phil Davis is looking at this case too, and Phil Davis is the best civil rights lawyer this side of the Mississippi. And that's how widely respected he was for his legal acumen.
Phil's parenting was much like his way of being my co-counsel and my teammate. He encouraged, he found things to praise, but he never exaggerated those things. Phil has helped Nick and Rachel see themselves accurately, and he has challenged them to rise to the occasion. And Nick's doing it right this minute. Nick just had his first jury trial where his father had no part. And Rachel, who's a doctor, Phil called her Dr. Rachel many times in our collective presence because he helped her develop her unique and distinct strengths and qualifications and then deferred to them and relied on them. And so he helped each kid become them, not some image that Phil might have had of what a child should be like.
The thing I admire most about Phil was his commitment, both to his family and to civil rights, particularly civil rights in New Mexico. He was well liked and well received by the national ACLU when we were working on things, but his commitment really was here in New Mexico for all over the state. And he realized how important it was to have somebody fighting for civil rights for those who were in New Mexico.
You know, I mean, I learned a lot of civil rights law and how to practice from Phil. But what I really learned from Phil was how to be a loving human being. He loved his family so much. He loved his wife and his kids and his grandkids so much. And you could just see it in the way that he talked about them. We'd have these breakfasts, and you know, we'd catch up and talk about his family and whether or not, if they were going to go to the cabin and what they were doing for their summers and how the grandkids were. And we talk about my cases or my teaching, and then we'd go to leave, and he'd always end the breakfast, with a hug and say, "Love ya." And who does that? He was just a lovely human being.
Phil lawyered to the last day. Phil lawyered to the last hour and a half of his life because that was his passion, to provide access to justice to all comers. Phil, unlike many, made it a point to provide access to justice to those least able to buy it. And it was most essential to Phil that he be the conduit for people who didn't have power and prestige and status to get access to justice. And oftentimes, Phil actually got them justice. And so this school, if it stands for anything, stands for the Phil Davis values that he manifested every day of his life to the last hours of his life.
The last time I saw him was at a memorial for Reber Bolt, another ACLU former legal director. And it was at Judge Rod Kennedy's home. And because of the pandemic, we hadn't gotten to see each other as much. And I'm so thankful that Rod had that memorial service, so I could say that I saw Phil one last time.
Phil saw me. Phil got me. Phil accepted me and respected me enough to point out my faults. He cared about me so deeply that he helped me be a better person.
I want to thank the family for asking me to speak on behalf of Phil in this award ceremony. It was a great honor for me to speak. It was also a great honor to be asked to speak at his celebration of life a while ago. It's hard for me to speak about Phil because in some ways I haven't admitted to myself that he's no longer there at the other end of a phone call or an email. But I really want to thank the family for asking me to do this. And I also want to thank the family for sharing him with us, because the us is the what we call the firm, and the firm is all those civil rights attorneys out there in New Mexico who are fighting every day for the people of New Mexico. And Phil was the leader of the firm. And so I thank the family for asking me to do this.
When Nick asked me if I would talk, I remember my initial reaction to Nick was, yes, of course. My initial reaction inside was, I don't know if I can do this, because I just really love the guy. And it means so much to be able to talk to you all about him, because he was just such a lovely, warm human being and such a kind friend. Yes, he was a wonderful, amazing litigator. Yes, he was a terrific civil rights attorney. He was Mr. Civil Rights New Mexico. But to me, he was the other guy on the other side of the breakfast table, listening to what I had to say and caring about what I had to say. And I really missed that. And so getting to talk about that means the world to me.
Phil's family is my family. And Lee and Nick and Rachel have been my sister and niece and nephew, just like Phil has been my brother all these years. And among the hundreds of people who admire Phil, you choosing me to speak on his behalf is one of the greatest honors I've ever had.